Do you believe a creature once hunted and feared could return, not for revenge, but to repay a kindness? In the remote edges of Michigan's Hiawatha forest, an elderly woman lived alone. One stormy night, a towering figure, over 7 feet tall, stepped into her kitchen. The truth is, it wasn't humans who protected her that night. It was the forest, and something in the forest. Strange signs had been appearing for weeks. Twisted birch wreaths on her porch, pine cones shaped into arrows pointing to the river. None of it was random. This story is based on verified local reports, interviews, and over a dozen records surrounding a legendary presence in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I'm going to walk you through it, step by step. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Bigfoot may not be a monster at all, but a memory, a guardian, a debt repaid in silence, and how a single act of kindness, decades ago, saved a life during the darkest night. In 1987, Opal Thatcher refused to sell her land to a greedy developer. Days later, 3 men stormed her cabin in a snowstorm, only to be stopped cold by a silent, massive figure standing between them and the old woman. No one was harmed, but news of a nameless forest guardian spread like wildfire. If you've ever wondered whether goodness truly comes back around, watch this video until the end, before it vanishes like footprints in the snow. Autumn was in its golden final act along the Manistique River, the kind that hums low through the trees and sets the air heavy with cedar and memory. The light stretched thin over the water, diffused through bare birch branches like gauze, and in the last hour of the sun, a cream-colored station wagon pulled off the gravel turn of Thatcher's path and rolled to a gentle stop outside the weather-worn cabin nestled into the hill. Grant Salvey stepped out in shoes too polished for this part of Michigan. The wind, steady and cool, tugged at the edge of his pressed coat. He paused for a moment, eyeing the tree line beyond the cabin where the pines stood unmoved, not bowing to any kind of welcome. His smile was soft, shaped to disarm. He knocked, 3 quick taps, businesslike, and waited. From inside, nothing stirred. But the door was unlocked. He pushed gently and stepped inside, careful not to dirty the braided rug beneath his feet. "Ms. Thatcher?" he called, voice level, eyes scanning the space. Cast iron stove, a rocking chair draped in a red and gray checkered wool blanket, a single photograph on the shelf above the hearth. The air smelled of lavender soap and old pine. No answer came. But something hung on the inside of the door, a square of yellowed stationery, held by a pin. Grant stepped back to read it. In delicate cursive, no more than 5 words. "This land is under watch. No signature, no date, just a note. Not of fear or surrender, but of presence." He stared at it a moment longer than he meant to, lips tightening ever so slightly. He stepped back out and let the screen door close with a hollow whump behind him. His gaze dropped, and there, at the threshold, he saw it. A single dry birch leaf, long browned and curled at the edges, pressed beneath a perfectly smooth round stone. Just off-center, deliberate. He bent to look closer. Not a coincidence. This was a message, or a ritual, or both. He stood up slowly, scanning the tree line again. "Message received," he muttered, voice softer this time. He walked back to his car, hand already reaching into his coat pocket for the keys. But then he stopped. 20 yards away, near the trail where the edge of the forest met the last wild lilacs, something had changed. He frowned. Bright orange survey stakes, the kind he'd had driven into the soil last week to mark property lines, were no longer upright. They'd been pulled, and not just tossed, arranged, laid down in a sweeping arc, bent into the soil like teeth from an old jaw. 5 stakes, positioned tip out, all of them pointing toward him. The back of his neck tightened. He stood there, hand on the car door, staring at them, as if expecting someone to step out from behind the trunk of a white pine and admit the prank. But no one came. The woods held their silence like an old grudge. Grant glanced once more at the cabin, then back at the trees, then opened the driver's side door and got in. As he drove away, dust from the wheels kicked up and scattered like moths in his rear-view mirror. Inside, the cabin had grown darker. The last lines of sunlight crawled across the worn kitchen floor like reaching fingers. Opal Thatcher moved slowly across the room, not yet lighting the lamps. The hush of the woods seeped through the window panes, broken only by the low creak of a rocking chair as she eased herself into it. Her hair, long and silver, fell over her shoulder as she reached for the wooden brush. With slow strokes, she untangled the strands while staring into the wavering light of the stove flame. Her face held the quiet patience of someone who had stopped measuring years by clocks or calendars, only by seasons and what they took with them. On her lap sat a folded piece of fabric, a knitted scarf, deep burgundy and soft at the edges, worn in one corner. She smoothed it with one hand, then folded it once more and set it on the empty chair across from her. Not a word was spoken, not even whispered. She moved through the house like a ghost, keeping house for another ghost. The kettle whistled, the fire settled, and outside, the wind began to rise in thin sobs through the trees. Much later, deep into the night, the kind of dark that has no edges, no moon, no distance, only weight. She sat awake again, this time not in the chair, but at the little table near the front window. The old ledger open before her, pen held in loose fingers. Her writing was slow, one line, a pause, another, then none at all. She stopped because she heard it, a sound too careful to be wind. Not loud, not quick. Tap, a pause, tap, longer pause, tap. 3 soft knocks. Not on the door, on the wood frame of the side wall, the old cedar planks that faced the forest. She didn't move at first, just let her breath go still. Her eyes remained on the page, but she no longer saw it. The pen in her hand touched nothing. The knocks hadn't come from the porch, not from the road, not even from a height that matched a man's shoulder. They had come from lower, maybe waist height. Not hurried, not curious, rhythmic, like a memory remembering itself. She turned slowly toward the window but didn't rise. The curtains were drawn. She didn't need to look to know that nothing would be there, not in the way a person would see, but still she spoke. Not aloud, not with voice, only in the breath she let out, warm and full, that hung a moment in the cool air like a soft reply. And in the space it left behind, she reached across the table and laid her hand gently over the scarf. Outside, the wind picked up, curling dry leaves against the cabin siding like fingers tracing braille. The birches leaned, the stars stayed hidden, and just before the quiet sealed itself back shut, something moved again at the edge of the clearing, slow, upright, just beyond the line of trees. Not near, not far, not threat, not friend, but aware. Then, like a curtain slowly closing, the woods swallowed the movement whole, and the house fell back into stillness, with only the kettle ticking its last heat, and the log in the fire splitting down its center, like a breath held too long, until morning. But morning wouldn't explain anything, only repeat what had begun, and the leaf under the stone would still be there, only a little darker from the dew. The frost had thickened overnight. It clung to the cabin's eaves in soft white ridges and turned the grass brittle beneath Opal's boots as she stepped out at dawn. Her breath came out in clouds. The river moved slow and dark through the trees. No bird song, just the hush of cold settling into the bones of the valley. She didn't need long to notice it. The wooden bird cage hanging from the edge of the porch had been shattered. The slats were snapped sharp, as if pried apart by force. Not by hand, not a child's prank. The break was too crude, the angles too tense. Splinters curled like teeth. One of the iron nails was bent sideways. A second, missing. She crouched low, fingers brushing the debris. The cage had been hanging there since spring. She hadn't touched it in months. No birds had nested in it for years. It was never about that. It was about presence. Watching, welcoming. Now it was broken open, as if someone wanted that presence gone. She picked up one of the snapped slats, examined the split, turned it in her hand. On one edge, faint but there, were scrape marks. Fine parallel lines, not from claws. Toolwork, metal. She stood. The porch boards creaked beneath her as she moved back toward the door. By mid-morning, the frost had melted to a cold slickness, and Deputy Ron Petrie's cruiser pulled up behind the old chicken coop. He didn't knock, just called out from the path. "Ms. Thatcher." She met him at the edge of the porch, coat tied, scarf tucked, jaw set like stone. She held out the broken piece of wood. He took it, turned it once in his gloved hand, and exhaled slow. "Looks like maybe a raccoon or—" He didn't finish the guess. She was still watching him. He glanced back at the porch rail. "Well, could be some kids from town messing around too. They'd leave a mess," Opal said flatly. He gave a half smile, polite. "I'll drive through the ridge again this afternoon, see if anyone's been poking where they shouldn't." He didn't write anything down. As he turned to leave, he said over his shoulder, "You know, it'll only get harder out here this winter." She said nothing. He paused. "Don't be afraid to reach out," he added gently as he got into the car. "You're not invisible." But by the time his engine faded down the path, she was already facing the woods again. 10 minutes later, another car pulled up. The same pale station wagon from the day before. Grant Salvey stepped out, this time holding a paper coffee cup and a manila folder. He smiled. Again too soft, again too warm. "I figured you'd still be out here," he said, stepping over the scattered leaves toward the porch. "Can't get this view in a condo." He offered the coffee. She didn't take it. "You got people who care, Opal," he said, with a rehearsed kind of concern. "But caring don't keep the pipes from freezing, or the roof from sagging." She still didn't speak. He sighed, stepped back, tried to chuckle. "Winter's long up here. It'd wear anybody down." She met his eyes then, for just a breath. Long enough that he shifted the folder from one hand to the other. His gaze wandered past her to the porch railing, and there, right where the bird cage had been, was something new. A tight, perfect rosette, crafted from birch bark, spiraled inward and tied at the center with what looked like a pine needle. The folds were smooth, precise. The pattern wasn't human, but it wasn't careless either. It belonged. Grant's mouth hung slightly open. That yours?" She didn't answer. He blinked. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "you let me know if you change your mind." He walked back to the car without looking behind him. The folder remained unopened. The coffee cooled in his hand. That night, after the door was locked and the curtains pulled, Opal sat in the quiet glow of the stove again. She'd moved the rosette from the porch and placed it gently beside a bowl of dried lavender. She didn't touch it, just watched it. The shadows flickered over its spiral like it might breathe. Outside, the wind was climbing. A storm was threatening farther off. But inside the cabin, it was the past that moved louder than weather. She sat with the silence a long time before reaching for the old leather-bound journal on the mantel. Her hands shook as she opened to a dog-eared page marked 1962. It had rained that day. She remembered it clear. She remembered the metal trap sunk into the earth, the teeth rusted but still eager. She remembered the scream, not human, not bear, that echoed under the canopy like it was lost from time. She remembered the trembling shape, hunched and young, fur soaked and tangled, eyes wild with a pain that wasn't just physical. And she remembered kneeling, rain soaking her dress, fingers numb as she cut the wire with her husband's old blade, breath holding steady as she spoke calm words to something that wouldn't understand the language, but might understand mercy. She had left a circle of grass behind when she fled. An apology. That was all she could do back then. She had never spoken of it. But now something remembered. She set the journal down, closed it with care, and rose to throw another log into the fire. Her knees popped as she moved. She steadied herself on the side of the hearth and whispered something. Not a prayer, not a plea. Just her own voice, trying to remind her that she was still here. Outside, the wind curled under the cabin eaves. The glass in the window pane pulsed softly. Then the moment stilled. She walked slowly to the front door, cracked it open just an inch. Cold air kissed her face. Nothing stirred on the path. But as she stepped back, a shape caught the edge of her vision. A single birch leaf, dry, whole, spinning like a coin in slow motion. It drifted down with eerie grace and landed on the top porch step. Not blown, not dropped. Placed. She stood a long while without blinking, just watching it. The fire behind her hissed. The wind shifted. The leaf didn't move. And in that frozen breath of silence, she knew. The watching hadn't stopped. It had shifted closer. Not threatened, not welcomed. Only present, like a line waiting to be read again. Before the light fully returned, the smoke had already begun its retreat, curling into the pine fog, mingling with the early hush like something ashamed. The smell clung low over the river and drifted down through the branches like a warning not shouted, but whispered by the land itself. Ash rained soft over the tall grass, and where the grain barn once stood, there was only ruin now. Blackened bones, charcoal where timber had been. No flames, just a smoldering body, long dead before Opal awoke. She hadn't heard a thing. She stood barefoot in the dirt. Wool's shawl clutched at her chest, the cold pressing hard against her heels. The fire had spared the cabin, but it had taken everything in the barn. Seed, feed. The weathered canisters of flour she'd ground herself. The copper pot Marin had once polished until her reflection looked back brighter than the real thing. Now only scorched nails and beams folded in on themselves remained. And something else. Near the outer wall, half sunken in soot, was the imprint of a hand. Not a human one. Broader, longer. The heel of the palm pressed deep, fingers extended, and all across the ridge of the print, faint filaments of fine dark fur had been caught in the damp ash. She didn't touch it, just stared. The morning air moved around her like a breath held in too long. Her eyes followed the print, then slowly shifted outward. Tracks. They circled the barn, some light, some heavy, most unreadable in the ruin. But among them, between the churn of burnt wood and earth, were boot prints, rushed, wide apart, like someone had moved fast, too fast for someone just passing through. She turned toward the woods. She didn't speak, but the wind caught the fringe of her shawl and lifted it like something trying to say, "I see you too." By noon, the smoke had thinned, but the smell of ruin lingered in her clothes and hair. She didn't change. She didn't go inside. Instead, she sat at the edge of the porch with her knees drawn close and a faded quilt wrapped around her shoulders like armor. Waiting, the crunch of tires came around the bend. A gray pickup rolled in, engine grumbling. The woman who stepped out was no stranger to tension. Mina Corcoran, late 20s, wiry, quick with a notebook, quicker with a lens. Her boots sank in the mud as she crossed the yard, camera bag slung at her side. "Miss Thatcher." Opal didn't answer right away. Mina tried again. "I heard about the fire. They called it in. Said you were lucky it didn't spread." Opal looked up. Her eyes weren't surprised, just tired. Mina crouched, lowering her voice. "Do you mind if I ask a few questions? Off the record." There was no nod, but there wasn't a no either. So Mina opened the lens cap. As she framed the ruins, her hand paused. She zoomed in on the handprint, then the boot tracks, then the angle of burn along the outer wall. Split from the inside out, not in. Something shifted in her chest. "I've covered a lot of fires," she said under her breath. "None of them like this." Opal said nothing, but she turned her head slightly toward the line of trees beyond the wreckage. "You ever feel like you're being watched?" Mina asked. Still nothing, but the way Opal's fingers gripped the edge of the quilt said more than her voice could. It was later, when the sun had dipped enough to lay gold across the porch steps, that Opal noticed the next sign. 3 pine cones, not from her yard. Jack pine, not white. Arranged in a perfect arrow, pointed east toward the river. She stepped carefully down the stairs, not to disturb them. She crouched low, brushed the dirt gently beside them with her knuckles. The tips of the cones had been trimmed, she realized, precisely. Not chewed by squirrels, not fallen and cracked. Placed. She followed the direction they pointed with her eyes. Down the slope, through the poplars, past the memory of fire. Then she turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the evening gathered in soft silence. The walls still smelled faintly of smoke, even with the windows cracked. But the fire in the stove was strong again, and the pot on the back burner hissed quietly. She moved slower now, every step more deliberate. She lifted the wool scarf from the rocking chair, unfolded it gently, and draped it over the straight-backed seat by the hearth. The fabric caught the firelight, casting a soft red shadow across the floorboards. She left it there, a kind of invitation, one that didn't need words. Then she sat across from it and listened. Outside, the wind was still shifting, but it no longer felt random. It felt rhythmic, measured. Somewhere not far, an owl called once, then fell quiet. Opal closed her eyes. She breathed in the scent of ash, of birch, of the lavender that clung to Marin's scarf even after all these years. Time folded in. She remembered the sounds her daughter used to make when brushing her hair, the little hums, the sharp intake of breath before asking a question, the way she always checked under her bed even when she was too old for monsters. She opened her eyes. There was no one in the chair, just the scarf, just the space. But the room felt less empty than it had. That night, long after the stove's fire had dimmed to a quiet red belly, headlights lit up the cabin wall for a moment. They didn't stop. They turned off down the old logging road. But someone did get out. 2 men, Rafe Colburn, tall, wired up, twitchy fingers, and Doyle Voss, thicker, slower, but with shoulders that carried something coiled. Behind the wheel of the car parked halfway up the slope, Grant Salvey sat without his coat on, staring straight ahead. The 2 men walked softly, like they'd been told how to walk, like they'd been paid well enough not to ask why. One of them carried something under his arm. Paper, rolled, heavy. The moon was low, the trees held still, and in the cabin, the scarf lay untouched, but the fire suddenly sighed, as if something unseen had stepped between it and the room. A new kind of silence settled. Not empty, just waiting. The storm didn't start with thunder. It started with silence, a kind of breathless still that rolled in ahead of the clouds like a curtain drawn slow and heavy across the sky. Birds disappeared from the branches. The wind stopped moving the pines. Even the river seemed to hush its voice, as if something older than weather had just stepped into the valley and asked everything to hold still. In the cabin, the air grew dimmer by the hour. The radio, an old wood-paneled Zenith tucked near the shelf by the stairs, crackled in and out with a weak signal from Marquette. Static hissed around the words. Winter advisory, Superior shoreline, lake effect snow expected by nightfall. But Opal didn't need the weather report to tell her what was coming. She could feel it in the hinges of the door, in the joints of her knuckles, in the way the trees stood like sentries without breath. She boiled water, added more wood to the stove, and laid out the cedar branch she'd cut that morning near the logging trail, stripping its lower bark and tying it into a neat fold with a strip of linen. Not for ritual, for remembrance. The cabin, already sparse, was pared back further now. Clutter put away, corners swept clean, everything laid out with quiet deliberation. One extra quilt at the foot of the bed, a tin of matches on the window ledge, a single birch leaf tucked beneath the sill. She went to the door and pressed a new one, smaller than the last. Beneath the smooth, flat stone, she paused with her fingers resting on the curve of the rock, then stood, lips pressed into a firm, unreadable line. Out past the fence line, the sky had gone dull as steel wool. Snow was starting to fall, not in the flurries of a gentle winter beginning, but in large, slanted flakes that stuck fast to the windows and made the trees look like ink sketches against white paper. She stayed on the porch longer than she needed to. The wind hadn't started yet, but the weight of the air told her it would. Soon. She reached into the small wooden box by the threshold, something carved by her father during the Depression, still sealed by pine tar at the edges, and took out a bundle of dry birch shavings. She tied one beneath the porch rail with a frayed string. Not for decoration, not for luck. Just so the trees would know she hadn't forgotten how to say hello. She whispered the old words, the ones her grandmother used when she scattered salt at the windows. Then she went back inside. The lamp stayed dim. She lit only one, kerosene, set low, with the glass chimney fogging slightly as the room warmed. She dragged the old armchair closer to the fire, set a second mug on the table beside it, and placed a folded blanket over the back like a seat waiting to be filled. On the floor, just beneath the hearth, she laid another birch leaf. This one curled in on itself like a sleeping ear. The wind came just after dusk. Not a scream, not a howl. A deep, dragging kind of force, like something dragging its fingers across the top of the cabin, testing the seams. Snow struck the windows in sideways sheets. The logs groaned as they settled. She filled the kettle again. As the water warmed, she sat and listened. And from the woods, beyond the road, beyond the river, something began to move. Not a voice, not a footstep, but a shift, like something big shifting its weight, not close, not far, present. Then came the sound. The front door, made from thick cedar and fitted tight 30 years ago, creaked. Once, twice, then again. Not from the wind. The draft came from the east, but the creaking came from the west. 3 slow, deliberate moans of wood, like the door was being touched. Not opened, just pressed. From the outside. She didn't rise. She didn't blink. She just whispered to herself. "When you're weak," she said, almost like reciting from a page. "Make the place gentler. Make it cleaner." Her voice didn't shake. Her hand only trembled slightly as she set the second mug beside the first. Outside, snow blanketed the porch in full silence. No footsteps, no voice. But still, the door breathed, as if something on the other side knew the rhythm of the house and had matched it. Then it stopped. Not abruptly. Just let go. Opal sat still for what felt like the length of a prayer. She rose only when the stove hissed from the kettle nearly boiling over. She poured the hot water, covered the mugs with flat wooden coasters, and took her seat again, across from the empty chair. The fire flickered low and deep, shadows reaching up across the cedar beams like long fingers splayed in hush. Far behind the house, the trees groaned again, not from the storm, from something moving through them. Measured, heavy, rhythmic. She leaned slightly to look out the side window. The glass had fogged, but there, faint, barely seen, a shape, still, tall, broad-shouldered, coated in snow, facing the cabin, not moving, just watching. The outline was more absence than presence, a dark cutout in the falling white. Her hand reached for the scarf again, then stopped. Instead, she reached for the match tin and lit a second wick. The small flame danced beside the larger one. 2 lights, 2 chairs. 2 names unspoken. Then she heard it. A different sound. Not wood. Not snow. A click. Metal on wood. The back door latch. It was soft, careful, like someone unfamiliar with how quiet country places can be. She stood. The wind didn't shift. The storm stayed heavy. But inside the cabin, something had changed. The back door creaked. Not like before, not wide. Just a nudge, a push. A test. Opal turned toward it, the scarf over her shoulder, the silence thickening, and from the other side of the cabin, where snow wasn't drifting yet, and no footprints had crossed, a gloved hand, thick, dark, rested against the frame. No knocking, just the pressure of something that didn't belong. She didn't move toward it, didn't call out. She simply reached again for the cedar branch and placed it near the fire, right where the warmth would reach it first. Then sat back down and waited. Because whatever had come through the snow, it hadn't come alone. They didn't knock. They stepped inside like they owned it. Like the cold could be brushed off their coats and left by the door along with their conscience. Rafe Colburn came first. Boots stomping snow into thick mud across the floorboards. Tall, lean, movements too fast for a place that breathes slow. Doyle Voss followed close behind, slower, heavier, shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller but failing. And then Grant Salvey, cleaner, calmer, eyes scanning everything like he was already calculating resale value. The storm raged behind them. The wind howled through the trees like something warning them off, but they didn't hear it, or didn't care. Rafe tossed a bundle onto the kitchen table. Paper. Legal pads. Yellow with ink running from where the snow had soaked it. The corner curled, and the words on the top page bled out like a wound. Property terms, mineral rights, signatures that hadn't been given. "You know why we're here, Miss Thatcher," Grant said, voice soft but sharp enough to cut through bone. "This ain't personal. We just need you to stop making this harder than it needs to be." Opal didn't look at him. She turned away from the stove, quietly slid another log into the fire, and closed the iron door with a small clink. She reached for the kettle without a word. "You got no gas out here," Doyle said, trying to make conversation like they were neighbors visiting for coffee. "Hell, how you even keep pipes from freezing?" She poured boiling water into 2 mismatched mugs, then set down a third. The third one empty. The room didn't like that. The air changed. Rafe shifted his weight, glanced toward the shadows near the back room. "We're asking nice," he said. "Ain't nobody want to see an old woman get dragged into a courtroom." Still no answer. Opal set the kettle back on the trivet, lifted the small tin of dried mint leaves, and spooned them slowly into the cups. The storm beat harder against the windows. And then, a sound. Not from the wind, not from the storm. From inside, a low hum in the room's bones, a shift in heat, a breath that wasn't hers. The fire bent slightly. The flames flickered sideways like air had moved, but not from the door. Rafe turned, brow creased. "Did you feel—" Something creaked above them. Not the roof, not the wood settling. The ceiling beam, centered between the stove and the table, groaned. Rafe's eyes darted up. A hand, massive, covered in coarse black hair, fingers long enough to wrap a skull. It lowered from the shadows and rested on the edge of the beam, slow, deliberate, weighty enough to bend the timber ever so slightly. Grant took a step back. Doyle dropped the pen he hadn't realized he was still holding. Rafe froze. The hand didn't move. It just rested there. Still, patient, not hiding. Just present. The ceiling was low, barely 6.5 feet, but that hand hovered higher than it should have. The thing it belonged to wasn't crouching. It was taller than the room allowed. Or maybe the room wasn't what they thought it was anymore. Doyle's voice broke the silence. "What the hell is that?" But no one answered. The only sound now was the soft clatter of a teaspoon as Opal stirred the mint. She placed 1 mug on the table in front of herself, the second in front of the empty chair, then looked at Rafe. Nothing else. Just looked. Long enough to make his throat twitch and his hand start to inch toward the door. The hand above didn't move. But something else did. A breath. Low, steady, measured. It didn't come from the men, and it wasn't hers. It came from behind the wall of heat that had suddenly built between the fire and the door. Something enormous. Breathing slow enough to still a room. The wind shrieked again. This time it wasn't just wind. A faint rumble threaded beneath it. Deep, throaty. Too low to be voice. Too shaped to be weather. The mugs trembled slightly on the table. The rosette on the mantel quivered. Doyle backed up. His shoulder hit the china hutch. A spoon fell, clinked on the floor. The sound cut clean through the cabin. And that's when the door blew open. Not all the way. Just enough. Enough for the snow to surge in like breath from something running. Enough for the light to flicker again. Enough for the figure to step into the doorway. And fill it. Black fur. Shoulders so wide they grazed both sides of the frame. Eyes unreadable in the low light, but fixed. Not on her. On them. On the ones who didn't belong. No one screamed. Because they couldn't. No one moved. Because nothing inside them worked the same way anymore. Grant took a single step back. His foot hit the bundle of wet papers, and the sound it made, soft, tearing, defeated, was louder than the wind. The figure didn't growl, didn't raise its arms. It didn't have to. Its stillness was violence enough. Rafe looked at Doyle. Doyle looked at Grant. And Grant looked at Opal. For the first time, really looked. Like he was starting to understand that maybe the land hadn't ever belonged to her either. That maybe the woods had simply allowed her to live here. And now they were reconsidering. Rafe moved first. Not forward, back. Slow, careful, like something in his bones told him the same thing that had lit the fire. Turned the caged bird to splinters, burned the barn, left the handprint in the ash. Was in the room with him, and it wasn't done. Not yet. The snow had stopped falling, but not because the storm was over. It had paused, like breath drawn in and held at the edge of something unspeakable. Inside the cabin, the door hung slightly ajar, as if no one dared close it. The wind no longer howled. It whispered, but not in English, not in words. In a language older than roofs and chimneys. The thing in the doorway didn't step forward. Not yet. It didn't need to. It filled the frame. Taller than any man. Shoulders hunched slightly under the weight of its own stillness. Its fur was dark, matted with melted snow, beads of water catching firelight and turning amber in the glow. And those eyes, huge, unblinking, watched not with menace but with something harder to name. Recognition. Opal saw it first. Not the height, not the strength. The way it looked at the chair, at the scarf on its back, at the mug sitting warm but untouched beside the fire. She turned slowly, carefully, and she saw it tilt its massive head, just slightly, the way a person does when trying to read a name carved faintly into stone. Rafe made a sound in his throat, something between a curse and a plea, but it didn't come out right. Doyle still hadn't moved. He was staring like a child who just learned monsters don't hide under the bed. They build the bed and wait beneath it for a reason. Grant didn't speak. Not this time. His breath came in short pulls, eyes darting between the door and the empty chair, as if trying to calculate the fastest way out without tripping over his own past. But the creature wasn't looking at them anymore. It stepped inside, only part way. 1 foot, one hand brushing against the frame. The floorboards didn't groan. The cabin didn't resist. It allowed. And in that shift of weight, of space, something changed. It was no longer standing opposite the men. It was between them and her, and it stayed that way. Opal didn't move. She didn't need to. She turned back to the stove, poured another cup of hot water, and placed it in front of the fire. The steam drifted upward and curled like the tail of a thought not yet spoken. Behind her, the creature inhaled. Slow, deliberate. A breath that seemed to pull the tension from the rafters. The scent of cedar, of ash, of lavender and mint and old grief. Then it lowered its head, just slightly. A gesture not of submission, but acknowledgement, the same way a person might nod when passing a stone marked with flowers. Rafe stepped back, his boots thudding once, twice. Doyle followed without a word, his shoulders hunched, eyes never leaving the beam where the massive hand had rested minutes ago. Grant took longer. He stared at Opal, not in anger, not in fear, but in something closer to disbelief. Like a man seeing the ocean for the first time and realizing it's not there to be sold. But even he backed away. The door remained open behind them. The cold didn't follow. It watched. The creature didn't turn its head. It didn't threaten. It didn't follow. It remained. Opal reached for the scarf and folded it slowly. The fabric still warm, still holding the shape of something. She didn't offer it. She didn't hide it. She simply set it across her knees and sat down. The thing, whatever it was, whoever it had once been, looked at her with eyes that had seen centuries, then looked away. Its gaze moved toward the fire, toward the place where the cedar had been laid, toward the place where something had once wept and then grown quiet. The room held no sound. No one spoke. Even the flames dimmed, as if they too were waiting. And then, from the dark beyond the trees, deep, far, but close enough to carry, a sound rose through the snow-damp night. 3 slow knocks. Not on the door, not on the walls, from outside. from the forest. Tap, tap, tap. Not threatening, not questioning, just present. A signal, and the creature heard it. It stepped back, slowly, carefully, never turning its back on her, then stopped once more in the doorway. Its hand brushed the frame again, not to hold on, but to leave something. And when it stepped out into the snow, its footprints didn't match any tracks left by the others. They were broader, deeper, more deliberate. The men had come with noise and demand. This one left like it had never truly arrived. Opal rose after the door closed on its own. No wind, no force, just closure. She walked over to the frame, where the wood had darkened from where the hand had touched. Something small had been left there. A single birch curl, rolled tight, no larger than a wedding ring. She picked it up and held it against her palm. Still warm, still breathing, still part of something. And behind her, the fire flared once more, as if letting her know it was listening again. The room was no longer silent. It was attentive, and far beyond the tree line, where no one had walked and no trail had been cut, the knocks returned. Again, tap, tap, tap. But this time, not alone. By morning, the storm had pulled itself back across Lake Superior like a wet animal retreating to its den, leaving the forest hushed in a way that didn't feel calm, only paused. The kind of stillness that comes not after danger, but between its chapters. A new crust of snow had settled over everything, soft and clean and glinting like salt beneath the low sun. But at the edge of the porch, something unnatural had begun to surface. Opal opened the front door with her breath already visible. Mug cradled close. She expected prints. A mark. Some sign the thing from last night had returned or never left. But what she found wasn't a footprint at all. It was a line. A sharp, precise clearing in the snow where wooden logs, old, round, gray with age, had been laid in a staggered line, uncovered from beneath years of moss and needles. Not placed, uncovered, as if someone had brushed aside the forest's memory to remind the earth where they once stood. Log drive remnants, part of a history most had long since forgotten or paved over. They'd been stacked decades ago, back when the river still carried them. Opal knew the feel of them under her boots from when she was a girl. Her father used to walk that trail, used to mutter things like, "Don't look straight down at them. They're not for you." Now here they were. The first row clean, swept free of snow, no human prints nearby. The spacing too careful. The direction unmistakable. They pointed not toward town, not toward the old quarry. They pointed toward the cabin. She didn't step onto them. She stepped around them. Let them remain untouched, like bones laid out for someone else to count. The silence was thicker in the trees that morning. No crows, no wind. Just the occasional crack of ice slipping from the roof line, followed by the sigh of snow giving way beneath its own weight. She moved back inside, locking the door behind her, not out of fear, but ritual. An acknowledgement that something had passed through, that something might pass again. Later that day, long after the sun climbed but never quite warmed, the sound of spinning tires cut across the clearing. A truck, mud-caked, old but still humming, had wedged itself half-cocked in the ditch just down from the trailhead. Its front end had dipped into the snowbank, rear wheels throwing slush in futile kicks. The doors were flung open. No one inside. Rafe and Doyle had run. They'd made it as far as the tree line before the ditch swallowed them. After that, it was tracks only. But only for a while. Their boot prints faded fast, too fast. Deputy Ron Petrie stood over the ditch an hour later, gloves clenched at his sides. He looked at the truck, at the footprints, then back at the woods. Something didn't sit right with him. Something in the math didn't add up. One set of prints doubled back. The other veered off and disappeared near the creek. But no drag marks, no blood, just stopped. He crouched down to study the edge of one track, muddy, half frozen. Then something caught his eye near the fender. A rosette made of birch bark, flattened and damp, but unmistakable in its fold. Tied with a pine needle. resting against the tire like someone had placed it there for him to find. He straightened slowly. The wind moved behind him, low and long. Back at the cabin, Mina Corcoran returned, not with her camera this time, but with a satchel full of questions and a notebook she didn't intend to share. She walked slowly up the porch, scanning everything. The new snow, the tracks, the stack of wood untouched at the cabin's edge. She found Opal sitting with her back straight, the scarf folded beside her, hands wrapped around a cup that hadn't gone cold. "I brought coffee," Mina offered, as if it would matter. Opal nodded once, but didn't reach for it. "Something's happening here," Mina said, voice low. "I don't mean in the headline way. I mean something deeper." Opal looked toward the woods. "They remember," she said. "Who?" "The ones we forgot." Mina sat on the porch step. She took out a small camera, not her usual press gear, a personal one. She aimed it carefully at the log line, at the arrow of pine cones now partially buried again in the drift. She snapped 2 frames, then set it down. "I found something," she said, "about that pattern. The cones, the placement. It's not random." Opal waited. "They're directional," Mina continued. "Not just pointing, signaling. There's meaning to the number, the symmetry. It's communication." Opal sipped her tea. Her hand didn't shake. Later that night, as the fire thinned to amber and wind picked up its rhythm once more, Petrie returned. This time he didn't park up front. He walked the last 100 yards through the snow with a flashlight tight in his fist. When Opal opened the door, he didn't greet her. He just held out the birch rosette. This was on their truck. She took it gently, turned it over in her palm. It was wet, cold, but not lifeless. Petrie looked past her, into the room. The chairs, the fire, the scarf. "Anything you want to tell me about what's going on here?" "No." "You think I'm a fool?" "No." He looked away, his jaw flexed. "I know they did something out here. I don't know what, but it's not just vandalism. And that thing? That's not something I can file a report about." She didn't answer. He rubbed the back of his neck, breath fogging in the light from the window. "I read the article," he said. "The one Mina published last fall, about the copper logging camps, the silent watchers. Thought it was folklore." "It was," she said. "And now?" "Now it remembers us." He stepped back from the porch, boots sinking deep. "What should I do?" "Leave it be," she said. But he didn't move. "I can't ignore it." She nodded. "Then write it down, but don't try to fix it." Petrie looked at her one last time, eyes softer now. Not sure, but no longer stubborn. "I'll need something physical," he said. "Anything. If I'm going to protect this place, I need something official, not just stories." She stepped back into the house, came out with a folded page from the back of Marin's notebook. It had one sentence, "Land under watch." He read it, didn't laugh. Just folded it again and put it in his coat. Back in town, Mina's article went live 2 days later. She didn't call it Bigfoot. She didn't say creature. She called it the Unnamed Keepers. She included the log drives, the arrow cones, the handprint in ash. She published the rosette. The image caught like dry grass. People read. People called. And some didn't laugh. Some sent letters. Some sent seeds. Some sent knitted blankets and old cedar branches wrapped in cloth, folded with names of their own dead inside. The cabin stayed quiet, but the land got louder. And in the woods, somewhere deeper than maps reached, there was movement. Slow, heavy, old, but not alone. The snow had begun to recede, not by warmth, but by memory. Like the land had finally been heard, and now it was slowly exhaling. Along the north edge of the property, where the creek curved wide and shallow, the banks had softened just enough for the old ground beneath to show itself. Not all at once, not in one dramatic gesture. Just patches at first, stone, bark, rusted metal curled like ribbons in thaw. Opal stood at the edge of the north boundary before the sun had fully climbed, wrapped in her faded coat, scarf pinned tight across her chest. Mina walked beside her, camera hanging still, but unused. Neither of them spoke for a while. The trail they followed wasn't marked, but the way the snow had peeled back made it unmistakable. The forest had remembered it. Not a deer path, not a modern trail, a log slip, one of the original ones from before the dam. The kind her father used to talk about like they were altars, built for gods who carried trees on their backs and never once looked up. They followed the rise until they came to the bend in the bank, and that's where they saw it. A line of old drive posts, half-rotted but still standing. 3 of them. Not tall, just enough to catch your eye if you knew where to look. And atop the central piling, clean against the early light, sat a rosette of birch bark. New, tightly wound, tied with 3 strands of cedar. Mina raised her camera but stopped halfway. "I didn't put that there," she said. Opal didn't answer, because she already knew. She walked up to the post, boots crunching in the slush. She didn't reach for the rosette. Didn't need to. Its message was already in her chest. Mina exhaled. "The same fold," she whispered. "Same twist as the one I saw in the ash. But tighter, cleaner. It's like—" She trailed off. Like something learned how to say it louder. Opal nodded. She looked out across the creek, water barely moving, just enough to reflect the trees. For a brief second, the image shimmered. Something moved across the other bank. Not fast, not clear, but tall. Then it was gone. That afternoon, the county council met at the township hall. 4 officials, 1 clerk, 1 folding map, 2 black and white photographs printed from Mina's article. Petrie stood at the end of the table, arms crossed. His voice didn't rise. He didn't use the word myth or hoax. He used one word over and over. Witness. He told them what he'd seen, what he hadn't been able to explain, what didn't make sense and what didn't need to. He laid the burned contract on the table, edges singed. He slid the birch rosette across the wood grain. Mina submitted her full report. 3 pages, no adjectives. Just pattern, direction, replication, and absence of human interference. She didn't argue. She didn't speculate. She simply showed them the photos, placed the cedar strands beside the rest, and waited. The room stayed quiet longer than anyone expected, until finally, without ceremony, the clerk folded the final sheet and said aloud, "Preservation status is eligible." The vote passed. By dusk, a sign had been printed. Journalistic Heritage Preserve. Not large, not fancy, but enough. Grant didn't attend the vote. His car was seen that morning heading west toward Marquette. No word, no appeal, just a man who had finally seen something that couldn't be bought and knew it. Petrie delivered the notice to Opal personally. He handed her the paperwork without looking her in the eye, but she thanked him and meant it. Mina stayed late that night. Not to interview, not to record. She brought soup, bread, a pair of wool gloves she'd found at the co-op. They didn't speak much. Opal let her sit by the stove. The second chair was already pulled out. The fire cracked steady. Outside, the forest had gone quiet again, but not empty. Later, long past when Mina had left and the dishes had cooled in the sink, Opal stepped out onto the porch. The wind was light, barely lifting the corners of her coat. The trees stood tall in silhouette. The sky opened wide, scattered with stars. And across the clearing, just at the line where the birches turned dense and shadows thickened, stood a tall figure, not moving, not retreating, just watching. She didn't wave, didn't call. She simply stood, and the shape tilted its head, the same way it had nights ago in her kitchen. Then behind it, another shape, smaller, then another, a shift of breath among the limbs. A family, maybe. A tribe. Not gone, just out of reach. The stars above them blinked once as if in reply, and then, quietly, something floated down between them. A single birch leaf, loosened by no breeze. It drifted in slow spirals, landed on the step between her and the tree line, right in the middle. Not closer to one, not closer to the other. Just there, between. She looked down at it, and for the first time in weeks, Opal smiled. Not wide, not for anyone to see, just enough. Then she stepped back inside. The leaf remained. The fire inside sighed warm and low, and the forest kept watch. No words. No need. Some stories are not told to explain, but to remind us that not all things need answers, that sometimes what lives beyond the trees, what moves without name, what knocks without asking, it's not meant to be solved. It's meant to be respected. There are places where the land still listens, where memory doesn't belong to paper or people, but to the wind, the moss, the stones, arranged in quiet arcs. Places that hold grief like lichen, growing slow and soft over time until what was once pain becomes a kind of prayer. And maybe that's what we're learning piece by piece, that not all guardians look like us, not all warnings come in words, not all shelters need walls. Sometimes it's the silence that protects. Sometimes it's the stillness that speaks the loudest. And in a world that rushes to pave over the sacred, to bury the slow, to own what cannot be owned, there is power in remembering that some things cannot be taken, only honored. We all leave something behind, a mark, a sound, a gesture, and the measure of that offering, be it kindness, courage, or care, isn't in how many see it, but in whether the forest answers back. Because when you treat the world gently, sometimes it answers gently in return. And that answer doesn't always come in daylight. Sometimes it comes on a still night, through frost, through shadow, through a single knock, or a falling leaf. And if you're listening, really listening, you'll know. Thank you for joining us for this story. If it stirred something in you, grief, awe, or the quiet reminder that the world is bigger and softer than we're often told, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What would you leave behind as a sign of peace? Have you ever felt watched, but not in fear, in reverence? We'd love to hear your story. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, tales that whisper instead of shout, that ask instead of answer, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you won't miss what the woods might say next. Sometimes the forest remembers us. Let's remember it back.